The Stranger in the Vineyard. A story about judgment, humility, and what we cannot see. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over Bellavista Vineyard. For more than 40 years, the vineyard had produced some of the finest grapes in the valley. But that morning, a stranger walked through the gates. He wore old jeans, a faded shirt, and worn leather shoes. He drove an old pickup truck. He looked like a man who had come looking for work. Nobody recognized him. And that was exactly what he wanted. His name was Daniel Bennett. He was the owner of Bellavista Vineyard. But Daniel had a reason for hiding his identity. For months, he had been hearing strange things. Workers were complaining. People were afraid to speak. And somehow, despite record production, the vineyard was making less money. Daniel could have called a meeting. He could have summoned his managers. Instead, he decided to see the truth for himself. He had barely walked between the vines when a young security guard shouted, "Hey! You!" Daniel turned. The guard approached him. "Can I help you?" "I'm just taking a walk," Daniel said. "This area isn't open to visitors." Daniel smiled. "I understand. Then you need to leave." Daniel looked across the vineyard. "I've been here before." The guard frowned. "I'm sure you have. But that doesn't change the rules." Daniel nodded. "All right." He began walking away. But then he stopped. He looked back at the guard. "Tell me something." "What? Is this place still what it used to be?" The guard didn't understand the question. Neither did he know that the man standing in front of him owned the entire vineyard. The guard's name was Marcus. He called the vineyard manager, Richard. Richard arrived looking annoyed. He looked Daniel up and down. "Who are you?" "Daniel." "Daniel what?" "Daniel Bennett." Richard stared at him. The name meant nothing. "Why are you here?" "Visiting." Richard shook his head. "This isn't a public park." Daniel calmly replied. "I'd like to see the Eastern Vineyard." Richard laughed. "You can't just walk around this property." Daniel didn't argue. He simply started walking. Richard followed. They eventually reached an enormous oak tree. Daniel stopped. He placed his hand against the trunk. "My father planted this tree." Richard looked at him. "When?" 1978. Richard's expression changed. "How would you know that?" Daniel smiled. "I was there." He walked farther. Then he stopped beside a row of vines. This used to be the best producing section of the vineyard. Richard frowned. "It still is." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It used to be." He pointed toward the ground. The irrigation line was changed. Richard stared at him. "How do you know?" Daniel looked at the vines. "Because I installed the original system with my father." Richard said nothing. Then Daniel pointed toward a fence post. "Dig 2 feet from there." "Why?" "Just do it." A worker dug into the soil. A few seconds later. Clang! The shovel struck something. The worker pulled out a flat stone. Daniel said, "Turn it over." The stone was covered in dirt, but carved into the bottom were 2 letters. D.B. Richard's face went pale. Daniel Bennett. Daniel nodded. Yes. Richard stared at him. Then he whispered, "You're the owner." Daniel smiled. "That's right." Marcus looked horrified. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry." Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. "You were doing your job." Then Daniel looked at Richard. Richard wasn't smiling. Because he suddenly realized something. The man they had tried to throw out of the vineyard owned the vineyard. But Daniel wasn't finished. He spent the rest of the day working beside the employees. He carried boxes. He picked grapes. He ate lunch with them. And most importantly, he listened. Slowly, people began telling him things. Workers were afraid to complain. Breaks had been reduced. Some employees had been pressured to work while injured. And people were afraid that if they spoke up, they would lose their jobs. That evening, Daniel looked through the vineyard's financial records. Something didn't make sense. The vineyard was producing more wine than ever. But profits were falling. Large payments were going to companies Daniel had never heard of. Expensive wine was missing. And Richard had approved many of the questionable expenses. Daniel closed the file. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was disappointed. Then he remembered something his father had once told him. When something doesn't make sense, don't ignore it simply because you trust the person involved. The next morning, Daniel met a young worker named Ethan. They repaired a fence together. After a while, Ethan asked, "You're not really a visitor, are you?" Daniel smiled. "No. You're the owner." Daniel laughed. "How did you know? Nobody else would know this vineyard like you do." Ethan became quiet. Then he asked, "Are you going to fire Richard?" Daniel stopped working. "Why would you ask that?" "Because everybody knows something is wrong." "Then why doesn't anyone say anything?" Ethan looked down. "Because people need their jobs." Daniel didn't answer. Then Ethan said something Daniel would never forget. "People aren't afraid of the owner." He looked toward the vineyard office. "They're afraid of the people who control their paycheck." That afternoon, Daniel called everyone into the tasting room. Workers filled the room. Richard stood near the front. Daniel walked to the center. "My name is Daniel Bennett." The room became silent. "I own Bellavista Vineyard." People stared at him. Then Daniel said, "I came here 2 days ago without telling anyone." He looked at Marcus. "And I was almost thrown off my own property." Everyone laughed. Even Marcus. But Daniel's smile disappeared. "I didn't come here because of that." He held up a folder. "I came here because I wanted to know what this vineyard looked like when the owner wasn't watching." Silence. "And now I know." Richard stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, we should discuss this privately." Daniel shook his head. "No." Richard froze. "This concerns everyone." Daniel opened the folder. I found payments to companies that don't appear to provide legitimate services. Richard's face changed. That isn't what you think. Daniel looked directly at him. Then explain it. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel simply waited. And sometimes, silence is more powerful than anger. The investigation lasted several weeks. Daniel discovered that Richard had been secretly directing contracts to companies connected to people he knew. The missing wine had been sold privately. Expenses had been inflated. Workers had been pressured. Richard had been stealing from the vineyard. But Daniel discovered something else. Richard hadn't always been dishonest. 20 years earlier, he had been one of Bellavista's best employees. He had worked hard. He had helped build the vineyard. He had earned Daniel's father's trust. So Daniel asked him one question. Why? Richard sat quietly. Finally he said, I thought I deserved more. Daniel waited. I watched the vineyard grow. I watched everyone make money. His voice became quieter. I thought, why shouldn't I? Daniel looked at him. You could have asked. Richard gave a bitter laugh. You think people like me get what they ask for? Daniel answered. Sometimes they don't. Then he paused. But stealing wasn't the answer. Richard looked down. I know. Richard lost his position. But Daniel didn't humiliate him. He didn't seek revenge. He simply made sure the vineyard was protected. And then he changed it. Months passed. Wages increased. Working conditions improved. Workers were given a safe way to report problems. And Daniel created one rule that everyone remembered. Nobody was too important to be questioned. And nobody was too unimportant to be heard. Marcus, the young security guard, was eventually promoted. One day, Marcus asked Daniel, Why did you promote me? Daniel smiled. Because you stopped me when you thought I didn't belong. Marcus laughed. But I almost kicked you out. You were doing your job. Daniel paused. But next time. Marcus waited. Ask questions before making judgments. A year later, Daniel stood beneath the old oak tree. The vineyard was thriving again. The workers were laughing. The grapes were healthy. And Bellavista felt alive. Maria, one of the long-time workers, walked toward him. Do you remember the day you came here? Daniel smiled. How could I forget? They thought you were a stranger. Daniel looked across the vineyard. Maybe I was. Maria laughed. You owned the whole place. Daniel nodded. But I had forgotten something. What? He looked at the workers. I thought I knew my vineyard. He touched the old oak tree. But I didn't know the people inside it. Maria became quiet. Daniel continued. That's the danger of thinking we know everything. He looked toward the vineyard gates. We see a person's clothes. We see their job. We see their mistakes. We see one bad day. And then we decide who they are. He shook his head. But we don't see the whole story. Years later, Daniel returned to Bellavista. He was wearing the same old jeans, the same simple shirt, the same worn shoes. A new security guard approached him. "Excuse me, sir." "Yes. Do you have an appointment?" Daniel smiled. "No. I'm sorry. I can't let you in without authorization." Daniel nodded. "That's fair." The guard reached for his radio. Then someone shouted, "Mr. Bennett." Daniel turned. It was Marcus, now the head of security. Marcus walked over and hugged him. The young guard stared. "You know him?" Marcus laughed. "I know him very well." Daniel looked at the young guard. "You were doing your job." Everyone laughed. Daniel walked through the gate. He stopped beneath the old oak tree, placed his hand against the trunk, and remembered the day a stranger had first walked into Bellavista. A stranger nobody recognized. A stranger they thought didn't belong. A stranger they almost pushed away. But the truth was, he had belonged there all along. And perhaps that is the lesson we all need to remember. The person sitting beside you. The person you pass in the store. The new employee. The quiet neighbor. The stranger standing at the gate. You may be seeing only one tiny piece of their story. You don't know what they've survived. You don't know what they've sacrificed. You don't know what they have accomplished. And you don't know what they may become. So before you judge, pause. Before you dismiss someone, listen. Before you decide someone doesn't belong, give them a chance. Because sometimes, the stranger standing at the gate may be the person who owns the vineyard. And sometimes, the greatest lesson in life comes from the person we almost pushed away. The end.